but his best name move will forever be Psychopath, a classic inspect type move where you can see an enemy's HP with a very strange name that makes me wonder if it was a purposefully out there name or the weird results of translation and localization. For specials, the real psychopath of the bunch is Bowser, whose special moves all very much lean into his role as the traditional series Big Bad. There's Terrorize, Poison Gas, Crusher, Bowser Crush. We're one pig mask away from a Saw movie here, but in my experience these moves don't get too much play. The Poison Gas can be a boon in the rare many enemy fight. I found it very helpful when taking on the Axum Rangers, the 5-in-1 boss battle, but found little use for it elsewhere. And pretty hilariously caps it off with an enemy nuke called Psycho Bomb. A lot of mental illness in the Mario crew.